Okay, let's take a look at unemployment. And that's one of the two halves of kind of what we look at when we look at the business cycle, which is we'll look at inflation a little bit more tomorrow and then into the week that we get back from a break. But unemployment is kind of one of the big things that we're trying to balance. And essentially, what policymakers are often trying to do is they're trying to walk a tightrope, especially when it comes to the central bank, the Fed, that we'll look at when we get back from Thanksgiving, is you're trying to walk a tightrope between inflation and unemployment. You don't want too much inflation, but you also don't want too much unemployment. And a lot of times policymakers they're willing to live with a little bit of inflation as long as unemployment is low. That's usually the key thing that they want to do is they want to keep unemployment low. It has been a goal of the United States government and its economic policy since basically the end of World War II to pursue a policy of full employment, where basically everybody who wants a job has one, and those who are unable to find jobs, that we need to find ways to create conditions where they can. And so that has influenced a lot of our policy. Another part, especially the last 40 years, that has influenced a lot of our policy is the idea that everybody should own a home. And so we've, again, kind of adjusted policy to try to encourage people to have jobs and own homes. And so when the unemployment rate goes up, that's generally when the government and the central bank, especially the Federal Reserve, begin to act. So first things first, unemployment is the percentage of people in the civilian labor force without jobs who are actively seeking jobs. Okay, it's the percentage of the labor force. And this is one of those things where there's a little bit of math kind of involved. The labor force is people who are at least 16 years old who are either employed or looking for work. Okay, so if you are not looking for work, you're not unemployed. Okay, you're not considered unemployed. Basically, we can't blame the economy for you being out of work if you're not even trying. Okay, and some people aren't trying because they're retired, because they're full-time students, because they're stay-at-home parents. They've made a lifestyle choice to not look for work. There's also what we refer to as discouraged workers who have basically given up on looking for a job. A lot, maybe long-term unemployed, they've given up looking for jobs. They've given up looking for work. So we refer to them as discouraged workers. And so the civilian labor force does not count those people. If you're not looking for a job, we can't say, well, the economy is failing because you don't have a job. You're not even trying, right? And a lot of times that's because of your own choice, not because of something that's been forced on you. And so basically then the unemployment rate is the civilian labor force is our denominator. Our numerator is the number of unemployed in that, the number of people who are looking for jobs. And so a better way to put this is the unemployment rate is the people looking for jobs divided by the labor force, which is people with jobs plus people looking for jobs. So essentially, the percentage of the total number of people who are either working or looking for jobs that don't have work. Okay, so now the unemployment rate, actually does understate, because we mentioned the idea of discouraged workers. The other thing about the unemployment rate is that it counts part-time workers as fully employed as well. So if you've got a part-time job, you're still counted as employed, even though you're not working full-time. Even if, and again, some of that is by choice. Some of that is because people can't find full-time work. And so they maybe will work a part-time job or two part-time jobs, or they maybe will work a part-time job and then kind of a freelance job like driving Uber for some extra cash. So if you have a job of any kind, even if it's 10 hours a week, you're considered employed. And so the unemployment rate does not measure It doesn't factor in discouraged workers. It also doesn't factor in what we refer to as underemployment, which is maybe people who want full-time jobs but are working part-time jobs, or people who who are working full-time, but it's in a job that is much less than their qualifications. For example, somebody who maybe has a college degree but is working at McDonald's because they can't find a job in their area of expertise. That happened a lot in the recession of 2007 to 09, where you had a lot of, especially middle manager types, that got laid off by businesses, and they couldn't find work. The jobs just were not there. And so for a couple of years, they might go work at McDonald's or go work at a gas station or things like that because they needed to have work. And so we would call them underemployed. They're still employed, but they're underemployed. So there's actually multiple measurements of the unemployment rate. The one we know is what we refer to as the U3 rate. There's also what's called a U6 rate that measures the number of unemployed. And we'll look at the civilian unemployment rate here in just a bit. But now, there are three types of unemployment, and so, and they require different responses. Okay, there's one that we don't consider a major problem: frictional unemployment. Think about friction. Friction naturally happens, right? You rub your hands together, you're going to have friction. Friction is what allows us to walk without falling down. If you've ever tried to walk across a fresh sheet of ice, you learn how important friction is, because there's no friction on a fresh sheet of ice. And I work in hockey, and in one of my previous roles, I had to walk across the ice to get to where I was going right after the Zamboni, the ice resurfacer, had freshened the ice. So we had a nice clean sheet of ice. There is no friction at all, right? And you had to hold on to the boards just to keep from falling, because there's no friction under your feet. It's friction that allows us to walk. It's friction that allows us to sit in the chair you're sitting in right now without falling off, right? So friction happens naturally. So frictional unemployment is the type of unemployment that happens naturally. And we generally assume that the natural rate of unemployment is going to be about 5%, because it's going to factor in frictional unemployment plus what we refer to as frictional unemployment. So frictional unemployment is people who have been fired and are looking for a new job. Okay. And so it's people who are between jobs. Okay. So, they got fired either for cause or, whatever reason, they're looking for a new job. Okay. People who have recently left school, a lot of times the unemployment rate may go up in May and December because you have people who are graduating from college and they enter the workforce. They don't have jobs yet, but they are looking for them. And so therefore they went from not being unemployed because they weren't in the workforce to being unemployed because as soon as they get that diploma, they're looking for a job. And so therefore they count as unemployed, but it's frictional unemployment. People who are changing jobs. So therefore somebody who might be somebody who, say, left one job but hasn't started the next one yet, but they're going to work again. Or very short-term unemployment. We consider that frictional unemployment. You may be unemployed during the season. For example, if you're a landscaper, you're probably going to be, short-term unemployed during the winter, but then your job's going to pick back up in the spring. So we generally don't consider frictional unemployment a major concern because it's temporary. These people who are frictionally unemployed are likely to find new jobs. They're likely to find more work. So the ones we consider problems, and especially the one that we generally try to address with policy, is cyclical unemployment. And again, what's the root word of cyclical? Cycle, right? And so this is unemployment that is caused due to downturns in the business cycle. Translation, this is unemployment that happens during a recession. Those jobs go away during a recession, and then after the trough hits and we begin to expand, those jobs begin to be filled again. And so this is cyclical unemployment. And so, for example, things that we don't buy as much during a recession, or businesses don't spend money on capital goods. People generally don't buy, households don't buy things like houses and cars and appliances as much, unless their car breaks, or the washing machine or the refrigerator breaks. Then they're going to maybe buy those things. But generally during a recession, because people don't have as much money and because they're worried about potentially losing their job, they don't buy those things as much. They don't make major purchases. So as a result, people who build cars, or people who sell cars, or people who work in construction, building houses or commercial buildings, many of them lose their jobs because of the reality of a recession. People don't need their labor. People are not building houses, so we don't need construction workers. People are not building or buying cars, so we don't need auto workers. Factories are not expanding their operations. They're not building new buildings, so we don't need, again, construction workers and electricians and plumbers and the people who install those things. And so they may be temporarily, and temporarily could be as long as the recession lasts and then a little bit into the recovery, they'll be unemployed for a few years, potentially. But those jobs often come back when the economy picks back up again and people begin to buy houses, buy cars, build buildings again, buy capital goods again. And so generally, cyclical unemployment is often found in industries where the demand is very elastic, and they either serve businesses or they serve consumers in areas that are wants and not needs. For example, entertainment, construction, travel, automobiles, housing, things that have very elastic demand. The demand is very price sensitive. And so often the interventions that both the US government, Congress and the president, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank, try to bring into the economy during a recession are often designed to deal with cyclical unemployment. And, for example, one thing, that both FDR did during the New Deal and President Obama did with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was to try to have government-funded construction jobs. Okay, businesses aren't building buildings. We'll have construction workers build them instead, or we'll have them work on government projects, fixing roads or building bridges. And FDR did the same thing with the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration. And so, that's one way that we can from the fiscal side. And on the monetary side, usually what the Federal Reserve will do is they'll try to dramatically lower interest rates to encourage businesses and consumers to borrow money to buy a car, buy a house, build a building, expand your business. The third type of unemployment is what we call structural unemployment. This is long-term. Okay, this is a change in the structure of the economy. And think about if something happens to the structure of your house. For example, you add on a room. Well, that's a long-term change, right? Or on the flip side, something bad happens where you have a disaster or something that causes the home structure to change. But that is a long-term change, right? That's going to require a long-term fix. Structural unemployment basically is what happens when individual skills become obsolete. So these are jobs that are long-term and possibly permanently gone, okay? And so, this happens when, as both Republicans and Democrats have been lamenting, a lot of our manufacturing jobs have, quote unquote, gone out of the country to Mexico and to China. That's long-term structural unemployment. Those jobs are gone. They're not coming back, okay? And they're not coming back not because of some failure of government policy. They're not coming back because of the law of comparative advantage. There's less in the law of opportunity cost. There is less to give up when you have your supply chains in China, for example, and it's cheaper, you give up less to hire a worker for $3 a day and then ship it here, and then have a warehousing worker or a truck driver or an airline pilot or a railroad engineer put that on a truck or a plane or a train, and then ship it to a warehouse and then ship it to Walmart. We still have jobs, but the jobs aren't in making the goods anymore. The jobs are in warehousing them, transporting them, and selling them. So we have more jobs in those industries. UPS goes up, UPS demands more workers, whereas Hasbro demands less American workers because their manufacturing jobs have moved overseas. Okay, and so it's a long-term change. And so people who worked in those jobs now need to be retrained. I had an aunt who worked at Columbia House. Columbia House, for people of my generation, was the greatest thing ever because you could buy 12 records and then tapes and then eventually CDs for like a penny. And then over the next few years, you had to buy like 3 or 4 at full price. And then, you had fulfilled your commitment. You got, 16, 17, 18 albums for very, very little once you averaged out the cost, maybe $4 or $5 an album. Well, she worked in their warehouse. Well, as records became CDs, tapes, and then CDs, they kind of cut back. As people began to stop buying compact discs and consuming their music via streaming, Columbia House ceased to exist. Mail order record firms or music firms, they ceased to exist because they got beat out by streaming. Right? Blockbuster Video, gone. Well, there's still one location. Why? Because they got beat out by Netflix streaming. And so as long-term changes in the economy happen due to changes in consumer taste, consumer preferences, changes in technology, whatever, the jobs in those old industries are no longer needed. And so those workers need to be retrained and trained to work jobs that are available now. So yeah, your manufacturing job may be gone, but you may be working in a warehouse instead. And so, workers with obsolete skills then have to develop new skills to become employable. Structural employment often also happens because of lack of education. And one thing we've looked at is that only 30% of Americans have a 4-year degree or more, and about 40% have no education beyond high school. And so changes in consumer demand obviously will cause structural unemployment. I came from the newspaper industry. 90% of the newspaper jobs that existed 25 years ago don't exist anymore because people like your generation, and quite honestly mine as well, consume our news over the internet rather than via newspapers. So the local newspaper has really, really taken a hit because of that, just because of a change in consumer demand. So technological advances, machinery might replace workers. Therefore, those workers then have to find jobs in other areas. Globalization also causes structural unemployment. We kind of talked about that earlier. The thing to understand is these are permanent jobs. These are permanent job losses. But that doesn't mean that, for example, factory workers or newspaper reporters have to just sit and wallow in self-pity for the rest of their lives. No, I mean, even after we've had all these changes in the economy, the unemployment rate, we have still largely been at statistical full employment for the better part of the last 30 years. So those jobs that are lost eventually are repurposed somewhere else. And so in an area that is more efficient and more useful to the modern economy. That's how markets work. Yes, there is some creative destruction where, the horse and buggy goes away and then gets replaced with the car, right? So our goal is what we call full employment. Okay, full employment is not zero, but it's basically the rate of constant frictional and structural unemployment. So we generally consider any unemployment rate that is at or below 5% as full employment. Okay, and so that is the goal of U.S. policy, and it's the goal of most policy makers as well, is to get to full employment. So I wanted to just really quickly pull up what the unemployment rate has looked like. Okay, full employment here is 5%. So since 2000, and you can see the recessions, the known recessions, since 2000, the unemployment rate generally has kind of hovered. We had a brief recession, and then by 2004, we were back to full employment. And then in 2007, we went above it. The unemployment rate went up to about 10% and then gradually came back down. And that's usually what happens is you'll see a spike of the unemployment rate during a recession, and then gradually those jobs get filled. And we had a long and sluggish and slow recovery that took several years to get back to 2007 levels. You can see it took 8 years roughly to get back to the 2007 level of full employment. And then from 2015 up until February, and really up until March when pandemic restrictions began to hit, we were at full employment or below full employment, bottomed out at 3.5% back in December. And then, boom, we went from March to April at 14%, and it's been gradually working its way back down to where the unemployment rate right now is at about 7%. So the market has kind of compensated for the shutdowns that happened that forced the unemployment rate really high, and then over time we've come back down, and we're still above full employment, but we're not that far above right now. It just a shade under 7%. So we're a lot closer than we were, say 4 months ago. So, and this is generally the pattern. Okay, we'll be at full employment. A recession hits, the unemployment rate will go up, and usually even after the recession ends, the unemployment rate will stay high for a while. It'll recover, and then it'll go up, and then it will recover. It takes time to recover from a recession, and so that unemployment rate will gradually come back down as the economy picks back up.